couple of overriding thoughts about the spiritual exercises and the graces, which in terms of the graces within individual exercises, as I'm sure you know, are found either in the second or third prelude in Ignatius's presentation of specific moments of the exercises. And in some cases, they vary from exercise to exercise. And in other cases, you have sort of a grace that's given for a week of the exercises. And in some cases, there's a development of a grace for the week. But I thought it'd be good for us to step back a little bit and just consider the notion here. So Father Futrell, in his book he co-wrote with Marie Cowan, has a piece on the dynamics of making and directing the exercises. And in it, he talks about this. He brings up this point. So the reality of the exercises, and many people comment on this, is a movement. It's a dynamic. David Fleming has an article about the dynamic of the exercises, and several others do as well. So the fundamental reality is a movement through an experiential process. It's not a verbal text that you're adhering to. Some people, when they look at the exercises, they'll say, well, you know, that's not what Ignatius said, but you know, a slavish adherence to the text, he points out, is not going to be terribly helpful for entering into the dynamic that Ignatius is inviting people into in the exercises. And the stages of growth in that movement are mapped out with identifiable means for reaching the progressive stages within a total movement. So moving from one place, one experience to another, that Ignatius has a guide to that. He has, as Futrell tells it, identifiable means for doing that. Now, the function of the director, he says, is to help the retreatant stay within that movement. That sounds a little restrictive. To move from and build upon each progressive stage of growth and reach successive goals. So just to put this maybe in a certain context. So if I'm making the exercises with one of you, and you're directing me and saying, you know, we're considering the principle and foundation, and it seems like I've received the grace that is proposed for that moment of the exercises. And I say, well, you know, now I'd like to pray about the resurrection. Director should say, well, you know, it's not really where we're, you know, what we should, you know, move to at this point. So, you know, it's not, you know, a controlling thing, but rather there's to follow the development within the experience of the exercises as Ignatius has presented it. So what he emphasizes here is in these identifiable means, what's central is the grace, the id quod volo, you know, that which you seek, that which you want. The specific grace to be prayed for in the various exercises. The grace functions as the prevailing guide for everything that facilitates the movement. And the way he presents this, to think about it, and I think this is helpful, is that the grace is an objective element that is interacting in the experience with the subjective experience of the retreatant. So, for example, the experience of contrition, sorrow, you know, remorse, compunction as a result of my own sinfulness, and experience of God's love for me as a sinner, that's the grace that we're seeking in the first week of the exercises. How that plays out in my experience of the exercises, your experience of the exercises, and everyone else's is going to be very different. So there's you know, a space and there's great latitude for the subjective element, but you know, the person making the exercises, guided by the director, can respond to the notion, have I received the grace of this part of the exercises. Has God given me the grace that I seek? Okay, so that's one dimension. So another source that I found helpful for thinking about this is an article written quite a few years ago by a Jesuit of this province, Ed Knerk. And it was in Studies in the Spirituality of Jesuits back in 1984. So that's before I was ordained. And so it's quite a while ago. And it's a very, I think, helpful piece. But it's written more directly to Jesuits. But it's about eliciting great desires. And this part, though, I think applies to anyone making the exercises. He writes that one of the more startling aspects of the exercises is the final prelude to the meditation. Here, Ignatius tells the retreatant the particular grace which should be asked for, that which I want and desire. Now, given everything what we just said from the reflections by Father Futrell, Knerk raises an interesting question about that. He's saying, well, Ignatius says you should ask for what you want. And then he tells you, this is what you want. So, Knerk picks up on that and says, so how can I ask for something that I may not really want? So I'm making the exercises. I go into the first week of the exercises, and Ignatius tells me to pray for shame and confusion. I say, well, I don't want that. So what am I supposed to do? So, he reflects on that a little bit. Shouldn't my desire be more spontaneous? Well, it's unthinkable that my desire would be, well, I don't want to be sorry for my sins. If I'm making the exercises, that doesn't make any sense. So they say, well, how do I relate this, again, the subjective element with the objective moment in the exercises of the grace? So he says, how do I think about this? Should I not be asking for what I want and desire instead of what Ignatius tells me to want and desire? So he presents a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is that these preludes, the second and third prelude, when it articulates the grace, are so general that anyone making the exercises would naturally want and desire what Ignatius suggests. So I say, well, if I'm making the exercises and I'm invited to consider my sinfulness, I ought to want to be sorry for my sins. I ought to want to understand myself in light of God's mercy and love for me. I ought to want these things. And Knerk says that's plausible enough, but he says Ignatius has already given us a more generic grace in terms of the preparatory prayer of each exercise. So he says well, there must be a little more to it than that. So he goes on to consider other possibilities. And he says, furthermore, many generous and well-meaning retreatants find that their desires simply do not coincide with what Ignatius presupposes at a particular moment in retreat. And that certainly could be the case as you go a little bit deeper into the exercises, and I'll show some things about the second week of the exercises, where I could see what Knerk is talking about would make sense in the light and the experience of some retreatants. So what else does he propose in terms of thinking about this semi-conundrum? So he offers this. A more satisfying answer is that Ignatius is not mandating anything. He is eliciting the desires. He's proposing desires. He's trying to elicit from the person making retreat a desire. So, and he does this in the exercises, Knerk says, by interesting our imagination. Now, of course, that's the interplay between the grace within the exercise and the other material. So when you're getting into, what it is I'm supposed to be praying with, what is the, consideration or the mystery that I'm contemplating. Furthermore, we presume something, and we propose this to retreatants at the beginning of the retreat, which is to say that they want to be generous. They want to be magnanimous. They want to offer themselves. And now this is also something we have to pray for. So this is a grace we ask for as we enter into the exercises. So there's a climate of generosity that's presupposed, and that's certainly very important within the retreat. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to remain steady. Indeed, I could go into the exercises, especially if I'm making 30-day exercises, the complete 30-day exercises, or making the exercises in daily life for a long period of time. I can start with an attitude, a disposition of great generosity, and things happen. And then maybe I find myself being less generous. And of course, that's one reason why it's very important to have a director who can help, start manifesting such things and talking about, well, what's going on? What needs to be discerned in regard to the experience of the person making the exercises. But the climate of generosity offers us the notion of how God is going to work with us. And as we move into the different mysteries in the life of Christ, etc., we're going to move toward desires that are more and more authentic, because we're going to be seeking to imitate Christ. He further notes that Ignatius believed that our more authentic desires would be Christocentric, and he hoped that we would deepen them to the fullest potential given by grace, nature, and our maturity level at the time we make the exercises. He knows there's no finish line in the exercises where we say, okay, now I'm there, I'm done. Life goes on, we continue to make choices, we continue to have feelings, we continue to experience spiritual movements, and of course, we have to continue to discern. Day by day, we're asked to consider possibilities which are more and more Christocentric. You desire to know Christ, to follow him, good. This is Knirch saying this. So you do that. Well, now imagine, what would it be like? What is it like to be with Christ in his suffering? What is it like to be with Christ as he offers his life? You desire that, good. Now consider this. So, the exercises go on, and he goes into, of course, the first one really is referring to the first week, and the second moving into the following of Christ. And he points out that there's another dynamic at work in the exercises. The broader desire, the grace that's in play within a certain week of the exercises is one issue. Then there are, in the exercises, a structure of each day. And if you're making the exercises, in the context of a retreat where you're away from everything, where you're praying multiple times in a given day. Of course, it's different making the exercises in daily life. This dynamic's at work, of course, in going through a certain week. The idea is you proceed from more subject matter to less subject matter, from the more general to the more concrete. And the desire to follow Christ becomes a desire to follow Christ in this particular place, in this particular time, in this particular dimension of the mystery that we're considering. So we gradually move to where seeking the grace is more and more central to the moment of prayer, or to the moments of prayer. The second thing I wanted to do is to just share with you, and again, there's absolutely nothing original about this, but I thought it would be helpful maybe for us to look at this and consider it a bit. How people interpret these graces and present them in different ways, in different versions of the exercises today. You see, how do we see this, for example, in the annotations? How do we see what Ignatius is proposing, and how do we interpret this and offer it to those who might be making the exercises, or consider it ourselves in terms of our own prayer and our own experience of the exercises, or our deepening of graces that we experience in the exercises as we go back and consider these things as material for prayer. So you have the text of Ignatius. He says, what it is we're doing. What are we doing in the exercises? He calls the exercises every way of preparing and disposing the soul to rid itself of inordinate attachments, and after their removal, seeking and finding the will of God. So central there in the presentation in number 1, the first annotation, is the experience of seeking to rid myself of individual attachments, and in order to be free to seek God's will in my life. So Ignatius is saying this is a general aim, goal. But of course, how that's going to be experienced in the life of each individual person is going to be very different. Fleming puts it this way: the exercises are good for increasing openness to the movement of the Holy Spirit, for helping to bring light into darkness, the darkness of sinfulness and sinful tendencies within ourselves, and for strengthening and supporting us in the effort to respond ever more faithfully to the love of God. So, you see the translation of what Ignatius is saying in the words of Fleming there, how he presents that. Then, of course, from number 21 of the exercises, which is the title number, they have as their purpose conquest of self and the regulation of one's life in such a way that no decision is made under the influence of any inordinate attachment. So Fleming's version, they have the purpose of leading a person to true spiritual freedom. It's not leaving a person, but leading a person to true spiritual freedom. To grow into this freedom by gradually bringing an order of values in our lives so that we find at the moment of choice or decision, we are not swayed by a disordered love. So I think that's pretty good interpretation of the words of Ignatius. But you think about this in terms of what a person is seeking, and that question of, well, is this what a person really desires? So in terms of the way this functioned in how Ignatius considered the early moments of the exercises, there's a question here, and it leads into a consideration of the grace that we seek. We're praying the principle and foundation. So this is from number 5, the fifth annotation. I mentioned this already. The person going to the exercises should enter into them with magnanimity and generosity in order to offer his or her entire will, liberty, to God. To dispose, that God will dispose of me, or person making the exercises, and everything he possesses according to God's will. So again, seeking and finding God's will. So Fleming's version, the most important qualities in the person enters into these exercises are openness, generosity, and courage. As retreatants, our one desire and hope is that God will place us with his Son so that in all ways, it should be, we seek only to respond to that love which first created us and now wraps us round with total care and concern. It's a little more poetic, but you see how he is expressing that. But there is a question, which is to say, not everybody who comes forward to make the exercises wants that. It is possible for somebody to be interested in the experience of the retreat, but look at that and maybe say, well, that's not really where I am. And so there is a question. Now, there's a lot of stuff written about this in terms of how you help a person enter into the exercises. Now, in some of the early directories, I do believe it says that Ignatius would spend maybe the early, just like day and a half on this part of the experience. But now you might, the person making the full spiritual exercises, you might spend 4 days or more even, allowing the person into the retreat, inviting the person to experience God's love, his personal love, God's love in all of creation, God's presence in all things, the grandeur of all that God has offered us and created for us and invited us into, and the possibilities before us in regard to that. So this is from Father Tony DeMello about how to approach the exercises. And it's a little more stark, and I just think it's another perspective. The first thing we need to impress upon retreatants is the quest for the eternal. If they're not part of that quest, we're wasting our time. He's very direct. Perhaps they're following a secondary quest where they will end up frustrated or they'll end up deluded with a certain amount of fake consolations that will go nowhere. In other words, DeMello says, this is Ignatius' approach. Jesus wants people to approach the kingdom with this disposition. They approach the retreat with the same disposition when they stand before the kingdom and say, I will sell everything to get this precious pearl, everything. He says, this is what we're talking about when we invite people into the first principle and foundation. Do we have that attitude? that Paul expressed in Philippians, everything else is garbage. You know, I have Christ. So it's like, you know, this nothing, it's all trash compared to the experience of what I possess in Christ. So it's a little stark, but say, well, you know, a person, you don't start a person asking for that grace, but on the other hand, that it is an issue that is raised in the moment of the spiritual exercises. I went back to look at the notes from when, you heard in my little biography that I used to work at the novitiate. I was the assistant novice director for some time. And when we took the novices into the 30-day spiritual exercises, the novice director I worked with had the practice of every time we, presented the next day's material for prayer, we put it on usually a one-page sheet of paper, and each one had a grace. So it was a grace that was proposed. So as you begin to retreat, you ask for the grace to be content in the arms of God without any fear and anxiety. So they tell the novice, pray for that grace, and you have some scripture that goes with it. And then day one, you'll hear the grace of that number 5 of the exercises. Pray for generosity, great openness to God's initiative toward me. Then in day 2, pray for awe and amazement and wonder at God's initiative toward me and his unique personal love for me. And then you'd be offering prayer material like Psalm 139, Psalm 63, or Isaiah 55. And then the day after that, to have a deep appreciation, realization, feeling, and taste for what it means to be a creature, to have God's love create me and keep me creating me every day, and to be totally possessed by the Creator. And then you might, offer things like Psalm 19 or Job 38 or Psalm 104. Then on the 4th day, this is all before we get to the material that Ignatius turns to right away in the first week, to have that joyous freedom that comes from always being dedicated to his praise and greater glory. And then there's material that goes with that. Then on the 5th day, we would invite them into praying for a deep realization of the mystery of sin in myself, shame and confusion at my sinfulness. So you can see how now this is with novices who have been spending weeks in preparation for making the exercises. We would give them, several days of prayer material on the graces really that are related to the principle and foundation, and this initial disposition of grace that Ignatius presents in the annotations, but also that are kind of presumed of a person who is going to be making the exercises. And remember, with novices, of course, they've chosen to be there. They've gone through a long application process, and they've had, in some cases, a few months of preparation. So you can understand how, while Ignatius would, before he took people into the exercises, the conversations that might have taken place earlier that might have determined whether a person really has the disposition to be able to even ask for these things. So in any event, I don't know, how helpful that is to mention that, but I just thought it would give you a little bit of perspective. So in the little bit of time we have left for this part, I thought I would share with you just how some of these graces play out in different ways, in like the grace of the second week. So I ask for the grace that I desire, not to be deaf to his call, prompt and diligent to accomplish his most holy will, the grace of the kingdom meditation. So Joe Tetlow presents it. What do I want? I want to hear Jesus call. I want to feel how great his project is, how tremendous his desire for it, and I want to be right there working with him. Notice the way Fleming puts it. I ask for the grace to know Jesus intimately, to love him more intensely, and to follow him more closely. Very similar. But Tetlow's version, I ask to enter into the mind of the one who chose to be born as I was born. So he's praying on the nativity, see, the incarnation nativity, and how he articulates the grace in light of the mystery in that particular moment of the second week. So notice how he develops that as he moves into other considerations in the early part of the second week of the exercises. What ideas and images filled Jesus' mind in the desert in the Jordan? I want to know them and to love the one who entertained them, and I would then follow him. Two standards. Ignatius' language, I want to know what knowledge of the deceits of the rebel chief to guard myself against them, and knowledge of the true life exemplified by Jesus, by our sovereign and true commander, and the grace to imitate him. So both Fleming and Tetlow have different versions of that, but look at the way Joe Tetlow translates that. I asked God to give me courage to see clearly the face of good and the face of evil. I ask him to teach me to understand intimately the way the mind of Christ works. So, his focus there, what are you asking for as you get into the meditation on the two standards? I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but I just thought, since we're in Easter season, I would jump to the way the graces are presented in the fourth week. And this, I think, is interesting because Joe Tetlow presents it three different ways in the first, in his presentation in Choosing Christ in the World. Initially, to feel glad and rejoice because Jesus rises in power and glory. Then he asked, there's a middle one, which I did not include, but it's kind of a halfway house between that. And I asked the grace to feel very glad and rejoice intently and sharing in the delight and joy of Jesus Christ that he felt in rising from the dead and returning to console his friends. So you see the grace articulated a little bit more in terms of the mysteries that one might be praying for in the exercises in this time, in this fourth week. So Fleming presents it just once, to enter into the joy and consolation of Jesus as he savors the victory of his risen life. So it suggests something that's a little bit more maybe helpful to the retreatant in terms of how to reach into the mystery of this week. You'll notice how in Tetlow's presentation of the graces that relate to a person praying over the contemplation to attain the love of God, how it's presented also in relation to the praying about the resurrection. And he does, something in his suggestion of what to offer the retreatant, where you start praying the contemplatio, the contemplation to attain love, while you're still praying the mysteries of the fourth week. And some people choose to, you have a few days of praying the mystery of the resurrection, and then you move to the contemplatio. But another way of doing this is to offer a person making the exercises, pray while you're praying the resurrection and asking for that grace. You're praying of the mysteries of the appearances of the risen Lord. You start to also pray, one of the prayers during that period, whether it's a day or that week, is praying the first point of the contemplatio, and then maybe the next day the second point, and maybe the next day the third point, or the next week, however your person or you are experiencing the exercises. So there's much more that could be said, of course, but I thought perhaps this would be helpful to look at, kind of how these graces are articulated and some of the questions that that might be considered in thinking about them.